The sound of Lindsay's body hitting the hardwood floor of Bruce Schaefer's law office echoed through the room like a gunshot. Her unconscious form sprawled beside the mahogany conference table, where inheritance documents worth $8 million lay scattered like leaves after a windstorm. Just 30 seconds earlier, she had been sitting smugly in her chair, confident that she was about to witness the reading of a poor old woman's meager will, perhaps inheriting a few $1,000s and some worthless personal belongings from the financial burden she'd been complaining about for years. Now she lay unconscious, her face pale as parchment, while the legal papers that had caused her collapse revealed a truth so shocking that her mind simply couldn't process it. I am Sherry Kronk, 78 years old, and for the past 5 years I've been living in what my daughter-in-law Lindsay considers shameful poverty, a modest cabin on the outskirts of Billings, Montana, driving a 20-year-old pickup truck and shopping with coupons like the financial burden she believes me to be. What Lindsay doesn't know, what she never bothered to investigate during her years of treating me like a charity case that was draining her household budget, is that I own 2,000 acres of prime Montana ranch land that oil companies have been trying to lease for fracking rights at prices that would make most people's heads spin. The irony was suffocating as I watched Bruce Schaefer, my family attorney and friend for over 30 years, kneel beside Lindsay's unconscious form while my son Thomas stared at the inheritance documents with the expression of a man whose entire understanding of reality had just been rewritten. The same woman who had spent this morning explaining to anyone who would listen that I was a worthless old burden who contributed nothing to the family while they sacrificed to support my basic needs was now face down on an attorney's floor, having discovered that the burden she wanted to dump in a nursing home was actually worth more money than she would see in 10 lifetimes. Should I call an ambulance? Thomas asked, his voice hollow with shock as he looked back and forth between his unconscious wife and the legal documents that revealed his mother-owned land worth more than most small towns. Bruce was checking Lindsay's pulse while I sat calmly in my chair, feeling a mixture of satisfaction and sadness that it had come to this dramatic moment of revelation and consequence. The papers scattered across the conference table told the story that Lindsay had been too greedy and impatient to uncover through respectful inquiry or genuine interest in my background. My late husband's family had owned ranch land in Montana since the 1892, property that had been passed down through generations and was now sitting on top of one of the largest oil reserves in the northern Rockies. The modest lifestyle I'd maintained wasn't due to poverty but to personal choice, a decision to live simply while preserving wealth that could provide security for my grandson Jason's education and my son Thomas's future. But Lindsay had never been interested in my history or my choices. From the moment Thomas married her 6 years ago, she'd made it clear that she viewed my presence in their lives as an unwelcome financial obligation, constantly calculating the cost of my groceries, my medical expenses, and the small cabin where I lived independently but apparently not prosperously enough for her standards. She'd spent years building a narrative about my worthlessness while positioning herself as the long-suffering daughter-in-law who deserved recognition and eventual reward for tolerating her husband's poverty-stricken mother. "Mom," Thomas whispered, still staring at documents that showed mineral rights leases generating more monthly income than his annual construction salary. "Why didn't you ever tell us? All these years Lindsay's been saying we needed to support you, and you've been wealthy this entire time?" The question hung in the air like smoke from a wildfire, while Lindsay began to stir on the floor, her consciousness returning just in time to face the devastating reality that the burden she'd been planning to discard was actually the golden goose she'd been trying to kill. Bruce helped her into a chair while I prepared to explain 5 years of hidden wealth, calculated silence, and the inheritance plan that would teach my family the difference between those who show respect and those who show their true colors when they think someone has nothing left to offer. Life in Billings. Montana had taught me that appearances could be deceiving, a lesson I'd learned during 43 years of marriage to Frank Kronk, whose family had homesteaded ranch land in the late 1800s when Montana was still considered the frontier. Frank's grandfather had claimed 2,000 acres of what appeared to be worthless grazing land east of Billings, property that seemed valuable only for raising cattle and growing wheat until geological surveys in the 1990 seconds revealed that our ranch was sitting on top of one of the richest oil formations in the northern Rockies. When Frank died 8 years ago, I'd inherited not just his life insurance policy and our modest savings, but mineral rights to land that energy companies were desperate to lease for hydraulic fracturing operations. The oil boom had transformed our quiet corner of Montana into a gold mine, with lease payments and royalty checks that generated more income in a month than most families earned in a year. But I'd made a conscious decision to maintain the simple lifestyle that Frank and I had always lived, partly because sudden wealth felt overwhelming, and partly because I wanted to observe how my family treated me when they believed I had nothing to offer, except the burden of an aging parent who needed care and support. Thomas had always been a good son, the kind of man who inherited his father's work ethic and sense of responsibility, but lacked the business acumen or education that might have led to financial success. His construction work provided steady income during Montana's short building season, but winters were always tight, and the economic uncertainty of manual labor meant that every month brought anxiety about making mortgage payments and covering Jason's college expenses. I'd watched my son struggle with the stress of supporting a family on a foreman's salary, while his wife constantly reminded him of their financial limitations and the additional burden of helping support his mother. Lindsay had entered our family 6 years ago with the confidence of a woman who believed she understood money management and financial planning better than the working-class family she'd married into. Her job as a retail manager at Billings' largest department store had given her exposure to middle-class lifestyles and aspirations that she was determined to achieve, despite being married to a construction worker whose income fluctuated with the seasons and the availability of projects. From the beginning, Lindsay had made it clear that she viewed my presence in Thomas's life as an obstacle to their financial progress. She'd calculated the cost of my groceries when I joined them for family dinners, questioned whether I really needed prescription medications that weren't fully covered by Medicare, and suggested multiple times that Thomas should explore more affordable options for his mother's housing and care as I aged. The small cabin where I lived had become a particular source of irritation for Lindsay, who saw it as a financial drain that prevented Thomas from investing in home improvements or family vacations. She'd researched nursing home costs and presented Thomas with spreadsheets showing how much money they could save if I moved into assisted living, calculations that treated my independence and dignity as luxury items that the family couldn't afford. But what had truly revealed Lindsay's character was her attitude toward Jason's college funding. While I watched my grandson work 2 part-time jobs to help pay for his education at Montana State University, Lindsay spent money on clothes, salon appointments, and weekend trips that could have eliminated Jason's student loans entirely. She'd consistently argued that young people needed to learn the value of money through struggle and debt, while simultaneously complaining that supporting me was preventing them from helping Jason with his educational expenses. The irony of her financial philosophy wasn't lost on me, as I sat on mineral rights worth millions of dollars, watching my family stress about expenses that represented a fraction of my monthly oil royalty payments. I'd opened a separate savings account specifically for Jason's college fund, adding money each month while his parents debated whether they could afford to help him with textbooks and housing costs. The decision to remain silent about my wealth hadn't been easy, but it had provided invaluable insight into my family's true character. I'd learned that Thomas genuinely cared about my well-being and happiness, even when he believed supporting me was a financial hardship. But I'd also learned that Lindsay viewed family relationships as economic transactions, measuring love and loyalty in dollars, rather than understanding that some things couldn't be calculated on spreadsheets or balanced like household budgets. The confrontation that would ultimately lead to today's dramatic revelation in Bruce Schaefer's law office had erupted 3 weeks earlier in Thomas and Lindsay's living room, where what was supposed to be a quiet family dinner had transformed into a systematic attack on my dignity and worth as a human being. The evening had started normally enough, with Jason excitedly sharing news about his academic progress at Montana State University and his summer internship opportunities, but Lindsay's mood had been dark from the moment I'd arrived with a homemade apple pie and a bag of groceries to contribute to the meal. "Thomas, we need to have a serious conversation about your mother's living situation," Lindsay had announced abruptly, interrupting Jason's story about his engineering courses with the kind of aggressive directness that suggested she'd been planning this confrontation for days. "I've been running the numbers, and we simply can't continue subsidizing her lifestyle while we're struggling to make ends meet ourselves." The word subsidizing had hit me like a slap, reducing years of family dinners, holiday celebrations, and genuine affection to a financial transaction that Lindsay apparently viewed as unsustainable charity. Thomas had immediately looked uncomfortable, recognizing that his wife was about to cross lines that couldn't be uncrossed, but his silence felt like complicity as Lindsay continued building her case for my disposal. "Do you realize that we spend over $400 a month helping support her?" Lindsay continued, pulling out a folder filled with receipts and calculations that she'd apparently been collecting like evidence for a prosecution. "Groceries, utilities for that cabin, medical copays, transportation to doctor appointments. It's money we could be putting toward Jason's college fund or our own retirement savings." Jason's face had flushed with embarrassment as his mother discussed his grandmother, like a line item in a budget that needed to be eliminated for efficiency purposes. "Mom, that's horrible," he'd protested, his 19-year-old sense of decency automatically defending me against this calculated cruelty. "Grandma Sherry isn't a burden. She raised Dad and helped pay for my school clothes and sports equipment when I was growing up." But Lindsay had been prepared for resistance, armed with research about nursing home options and financial projections that painted my continued independence as a luxury the family couldn't afford. "Jason, I understand you love your grandmother, but love doesn't pay bills or fund college educations," she'd said with the cold logic of someone who had confused financial planning with human compassion. "We need to be realistic about our capabilities and make decisions based on what's best for the family's future." The family's future apparently didn't include the woman who had raised the man. She'd married, worked 40 years in a factory to support her son's education and opportunities, and continued to contribute to family gatherings with food, gifts, and the kind of emotional support that couldn't be quantified on Lindsay's spreadsheets. She'd researched assisted living facilities in Billings, presenting Thomas with brochures and cost comparisons, while explaining that professional care would be better for my health and safety than continuing to live independently. "Thomas, your mother is 78 years old and living alone in a cabin that's falling apart," Lindsay had argued, her voice rising with frustration as she sensed resistance to her plan. "What happens when she falls and breaks a hip? What happens when she can't drive anymore or needs round-the-clock medical care? We can't afford to be her personal care service, and it's not fair to expect Jason to sacrifice his future because we're too sentimental to make tough decisions." The phrase, "too sentimental," had been the breaking point for me, reducing love, loyalty, and family bonds to emotional weakness that interfered with practical financial planning. Looking around that living room where I'd celebrated birthdays, holidays, and family milestones for 6 years, I'd realized that Lindsay viewed my presence not as a blessing or a connection to family history, but as an obstacle to her vision of middle-class prosperity. "Sherry," Lindsay had said, turning to address me directly with false sympathy, "I hope you understand that this isn't personal. We love you, but we have to be responsible about our financial situation. The nursing home we're considering has activities and social opportunities that would be better for you than sitting alone in that cabin all day." That was the moment I'd decided that Lindsay needed to learn exactly what she was trying to discard, and what her greed and impatience would cost her when the truth finally came to light. The morning after Lindsay's calculated presentation about nursing home costs and family financial priorities, I sat in my falling-apart cabin surrounded by oil lease documents, bank statements, and property deeds that told a story my daughter-in-law had never bothered to investigate. The irony of her research into assisted living facilities while sitting on furniture purchased with money that represented a fraction of my monthly royalty payments was almost too perfect to be accidental, as if the universe had a sense of humor about greed and assumptions. Bruce Schaefer's phone number was programmed into my ancient flip phone, the same device that Lindsay had mocked as evidence of my technological incompetence and financial limitations. Bruce had been handling my legal affairs since Frank's death, managing mineral rights leases, oil royalty contracts, and property management agreements that had transformed me from a factory worker's widow into one of the wealthiest landowners in Yellowstone County. Our 30-year friendship meant he understood both my preference for privacy and my growing frustration with family members who measured love in dollars rather than respect. "Bruce, I think it's time," I said when he answered his office phone at exactly 8 a.m., knowing that his punctuality and professionalism had made him the most trusted attorney in Billings for families dealing with inheritance and estate planning issues. "Lindsay wants to put me in a nursing home because I'm too expensive to support. I think she needs to understand exactly what she's trying to throw away." Bruce's silence lasted long enough for me to hear papers shuffling and his coffee cup being set down, followed by the sound of someone who had been waiting for this conversation for years. "Sherry, are you sure about this? Once we reveal your financial situation, there's no going back to the way things were. Your family dynamics will change permanently, and not everyone handles sudden knowledge of wealth very well." But I'd already spent 3 weeks thinking through the consequences of revelation versus the cost of continuing to allow Lindsay's disrespect and manipulation. The woman who was planning to institutionalize me to save money needed to learn that her calculations were based on fundamentally false assumptions about my worth and capabilities. More importantly, Thomas and Jason deserved to understand that their financial struggles were temporary and solvable, not the permanent hardship that Lindsay was using to justify her cruelty. "I want you to arrange a family meeting for next Saturday afternoon," I instructed Bruce, my voice carrying the authority that came from making decisions about millions of dollars in assets. "Tell them it's about my will and inheritance planning. Let Lindsay think she's finally going to get some return on her investment in tolerating the family burden." The plan that emerged during our hour-long conversation was elegantly simple. Bruce would present my actual financial situation to the family in his law office, reading from legal documents that would make my wealth impossible to deny or dismiss. The inheritance plan I'd been developing for years would be revealed in detail, showing exactly how my assets would be distributed and who would benefit from the respect and patience they'd shown during my supposedly impoverished years. "Bruce, I want you to make sure Lindsay understands that inheritance is earned through character, not calculated through spreadsheets," I said, feeling a satisfaction that had been building for 3 weeks of anger and disappointment. "She's been treating me like a financial burden who's draining resources from her family. It's time she learned that the burden she wants to discard is actually the source of security she's been dreaming about." The decision to exclude Lindsay from any inheritance hadn't been made in anger, though anger was certainly present. It was made with the clear understanding that money should flow to people who demonstrated love, respect, and genuine care, rather than those who viewed family relationships as investment opportunities with expected returns. Jason's college fund would be fully endowed, Thomas's mortgage would be eliminated, but Lindsay would receive nothing except the knowledge that her greed and impatience had cost her a fortune. "Are you prepared for the possibility that this revelation might destroy Thomas and Lindsay's marriage?" Bruce asked, his attorney's mind automatically considering all potential consequences of family financial disclosure. "Bruce," I replied, looking around my modest cabin that sat on land worth more than Lindsay's lifetime earning potential, "some marriages deserve to be destroyed when they're built on lies, manipulation, and disrespect for the people who made them possible." The meeting was scheduled for Saturday at 2 p.m., giving Lindsay 1 week to enjoy her fantasy of finally being free from the financial burden she'd never understood. The law office of Schaefer and Associates felt like a courtroom, as my family gathered around Bruce's mahogany conference table. with Lindsay sitting directly across from me wearing the expression of someone who believed she was finally going to receive justice for years of supporting an ungrateful elderly relative. She'd dressed for the occasion in her most professional outfit, clearly expecting to play a significant role in discussions about my modest estate and perhaps finally gaining legal authority over my financial decisions, living arrangements. Thomas sat beside his wife with obvious discomfort, his weathered hands fidgeting with his work cap while he tried to process why his mother had suddenly decided to involve lawyers in family discussions that had previously been handled around kitchen tables. Jason had driven down from Missoula for what he believed was a routine family meeting about his grandmother's wishes for medical care and funeral arrangements, his college textbook stacked beside his chair as evidence of the financial pressures that had shaped every family conversation for the past year. Bruce entered the conference room, carrying a leather portfolio that contained documents Lindsay couldn't possibly have imagined, legal papers that would transform her understanding of everything she thought she knew about family finances, property ownership, and her own future security. His expression was professionally neutral, but I could see the anticipation in his eyes as he prepared to deliver information that would rewrite my family's entire dynamic in the span of a single afternoon. "Before we begin," Bruce announced, settling into his chair with the authority of someone who had handled hundreds of estate planning meetings, "I want everyone to understand that today's discussion will include information about Mrs. Cronk's financial situation that may surprise you. Please hold your questions until I've finished reading the relevant documents." Lindsay's confident expression suggested she was prepared for surprises, probably expecting to learn about a modest life insurance policy, or perhaps a small savings account that would need to be managed responsibly. Her notebook was open and ready for note-taking, her pen poised to record details about assets that she assumed would eventually require her oversight and management. "Mrs. Sherry Cronk's estate," Bruce began, reading from documents that had been prepared with meticulous attention to legal detail, "consists primarily of 2,000 acres of ranch land in Yellowstone County, Montana, including mineral rights currently leased to 3 energy companies for hydraulic fracturing operations." His voice carried across the conference room like a judge delivering a verdict, each word precisely enunciated for maximum impact. The change in Lindsay's expression was immediate and dramatic, her confident note-taking posture shifting to confusion as she tried to process the implications of what she was hearing. Thomas's mouth fell open while Jason stared at his grandmother with the wide-eyed amazement that comes from discovering that someone you thought you knew completely had been hiding an entirely different identity. "The current estimated value of Mrs. Cronk's real estate holdings," Bruce continued, "is approximately $8.2 million, generating monthly royalty payments averaging $65,000 from oil and gas extraction operations." The numbers hung in the air like thunder after lightning, impossible to ignore or misinterpret as anything other than massive wealth that had been hidden in plain sight. That's when Lindsay's pen slipped from her fingers and clattered against the conference table, her face draining of color as she realized that the financial burden she'd been planning to institutionalize was actually worth more money than she would earn in multiple lifetimes. Her breathing became shallow and rapid while Bruce continued reading details about trust funds, college endowments, and inheritance plans that would secure my family's financial future for generations. "Mrs. Kronk has established a college fund for her grandson Jason in the amount of $500,000, Bruce announced, causing Jason to gasp audibly, "and has arranged for her son Thomas to inherit the family ranch property, which will eliminate his mortgage obligations and provide ongoing income through mineral rights leases." The final revelation was delivered with perfect timing. "Mrs. Lindsay O'Brien is specifically excluded from any inheritance due to her demonstrated lack of respect for the testator and her repeated attempts to institutionalize Mrs. Kronk for financial convenience." Lindsay's eyes rolled back in her head as the full implications of what she'd lost through her greed and impatience hit her like a physical blow, and she pitched forward out of her chair, unconscious before her body hit the hardwood floor of Bruce's office. 6 months after Lindsay's dramatic fainting spell in Bruce Schaefer's law office, I sat on the front porch of my modest cabin watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of gold and crimson, reflecting on how dramatically my family relationships had evolved since the day my hidden wealth became impossible to ignore. The same cabin that Lindsay had once described as falling apart and unsuitable for an elderly woman now served as the headquarters for managing an $8 million estate, though I'd made minimal changes to the simple, a lifestyle that had always brought me contentment and peace. Jason's transformation had been the most rewarding aspect of revealing my financial situation. The young man who had been working 2 part-time jobs to afford textbooks and housing was now thriving at Montana State University with a fully funded education and the freedom to focus on his engineering studies rather than financial pursuits. Survival. But more importantly, he'd gained a new understanding of his family's history and the value of hard work, spending his summer breaks learning about land management, oil lease negotiations, and the responsibilities that come with inherited wealth. "Grandma Sherry, I never understood why you lived so simply when you had all this money," Jason had said during one of our weekly dinners at the cabin, where we developed a tradition of discussing business decisions and family values over homemade meals. "But now I see that having money and needing to show it off are completely different things. You taught me that wealth should be a tool for security and opportunity, not a costume for impressing people who don't really matter." Thomas's adjustment to his mother's revealed wealth had been more complex, involving guilt over the years. He'd worried about my financial security and anger at his wife's treatment of someone who could have solved their problems instantly. The mortgage on their house had been eliminated within weeks of the inheritance revelation, and Thomas now worked construction by choice rather than financial necessity, his stress levels dramatically reduced by the security that came from knowing his family's future was protected. "Mom, I feel like I failed you," Thomas had confessed during one of our heart-to-heart conversations about family dynamics and respect. "I should have stood up to Lindsay when she was treating you badly, but I was so worried about money and keeping peace in the house that I let her get away with things that were just wrong. I'm sorry. It took learning about your wealth for me to find the courage to defend you." Lindsay's response to the inheritance revelation had been predictable and devastating to her marriage. The woman who had spent years calculating the cost of supporting me had immediately tried to repair our relationship once she understood the magnitude of what her behavior had cost her, but her efforts felt transparently motivated by financial regret rather than genuine remorse. Her attempts to convince Thomas that she'd always loved and respected me rang hollow when contrasted with years of documented complaints about my supposed burden on their household budget. The divorce proceedings had been swift and decisive, with Thomas finally understanding that he'd married someone whose love was conditional on financial benefit and social status rather than genuine partnership and shared values. Lindsay's demands for alimony and property settlement had been complicated by the revelation that much of their debt, relief, and improved lifestyle had come from my undisclosed financial support, making her claims of contributing to family wealth laughable in legal proceedings. "I never wanted money to destroy my family," I'd told Bruce during one of our meetings about estate management and inheritance planning, "but I also couldn't allow disrespect and greed to go unchallenged indefinitely." Lindsay needed to learn that family relationships can't be reduced to cost-benefit analyses, and that treating people badly has consequences that compound over time. The most important lesson hadn't been about money or inheritance, though those had certainly been useful tools for teaching larger truths about character and values. It was about understanding that respect and love can't be purchased or calculated, that genuine family relationships are built on mutual care and consideration rather than financial transactions, and that sometimes the people who appear to have the least actually have the most to offer, if you're willing to look beyond surface appearances. Lindsay had learned too late that the burden she'd tried to discard was actually the golden goose she'd been planning to kill. But her loss had become my family's gain in ways that extended far beyond money to include renewed relationships built on honesty, respect, and the kind of authentic love that can't be measured in dollars or calculated on spreadsheets.